I didn't know what to do that day. The tension was in the air, something breaking inside me with every passing minute. I was sitting in front of my computer, the blank screen reflecting my mind as confused as the situation I was in. Since I decided to study law, my dream was never to follow the family's path, but to work in a human rights NGO, fighting for those who truly needed a voice. But the pressure was unbearable. My parents, especially my father, insisted that I drop out of law school and take over the family law firm so the tradition could continue, the legacy preserved. I looked at them and saw myself drifting further away, feeling like my life was just a pawn in a game of interests that had nothing to do with me. I knew that if I said no, it wouldn't just be a career decision. It would be a definitive rupture with what they expected of me. I remember the moment when I made the decision that I wasn't going to give up on my dream. I said I wouldn't follow their path, that I wouldn't take over the firm. I was firm. The response came in the form of a coldness that cut deep. If you don't take charge, you'll lose everything. There won't be any more help. That's what my father said, and it was clear he was talking about financial support, the conveniences I'd always been given. When he cut me off from the family bank account, I felt something I had never experienced before, a deep loneliness, heavier than any physical pain. I didn't know how I was going to survive. The money that had once been guaranteed was now slipping through my fingers. I no longer had my family's support, could no longer count on their help, and the student loan debts continued to weigh on me like a mountain. Weeks passed, and the pressure of real life was more intense than anything I'd ever imagined. I started looking for any job that would allow me to pay the bills, but the job market was so saturated, and I was so unprepared that every door I knocked on slammed shut in my face. I could barely afford food, and the bills piled up, bringing a constant anxiety that wouldn't let me sleep at night. But the worst part was the loneliness. Not just the lack of financial support, but the emotional distance from my own family. I felt like I had been abandoned in a sea of uncertainty. It was when I started looking for volunteer internships at NGOs that something began to change. A small human rights organization accepted me, and my heart, though anxious, was filled with renewed hope. I was so happy to finally be able to work for a cause I truly believed in, that I thought maybe, just maybe, things were finally moving in the right direction. But that's when I discovered that I wasn't free from my family. My boss, who had always treated me with respect, called me in for a meeting one afternoon. He told me that the organization was starting to face problems with one of its major funders, who had ties to my family's law firm. My stomach turned when I realized that once again, my name and my history were being linked to the very place I was trying to distance myself from. That was a shock, something I wasn't expecting, and it made me feel like I was being pulled back into the abyss I had tried to leave behind. The pressure was mounting. I had barely started my internship, and I was already being viewed with suspicion. The gossip started circulating, the questions about what my father did, what the firm represented, what had once been a chance to contribute to something I believed in was now threatened by a connection I couldn't avoid. My boss called me in for another meeting and directly asked about my father's ties to influential clients who had business dealings with the organization. He didn't accuse me outright, but the way he looked at me made my stomach churn. Once again, I was being blamed for something I didn't choose, being seen as a potential threat to everyone around me. The feeling of being constantly watched paralyzed me, making me unsure of what to do. As time passed, the anxiety only grew. I was stuck in a dilemma between my own integrity and the choices I had made for my life. I knew that my decision to distance myself from my family and the firm had been the right one, but at the same time, the burden of my own conscience made me feel like I was wrong in many ways. The fear of ruining my life even further, the feeling that everything around me was falling apart, made everything harder. The days were getting heavier, and I could barely see a way out. It was as if, no matter how hard I tried to free myself, I was tied to something much bigger and stronger that I couldn't control. I was determined not to turn back, not to submit myself to what my family wanted for me. However, reality quickly caught up with me. I didn't know, at that moment, that my father was involved in even more shady business than I had imagined. It all started to surface when, in a desperate attempt to protect the family's image, he began making frantic efforts to save the firm. My father was forging documents, trying to manipulate financial results to create the impression that the firm was fine when, in reality, it was on the brink of collapse. My stomach turned when I realized that everything I thought I knew or thought I knew was at risk. How could I have trusted someone capable of something like this? The answer was simple. I had never imagined he would be capable of such things. I didn't know what to do with the information I had found. The notes were right there in front of me, but I felt completely lost. If I revealed everything, I could destroy any chance of reconciling with my family. But if I kept silent, I was complicit in something I no longer wanted to be a part of. I knew this decision would cost me dearly, but I didn't know the consequences would be even more devastating. I decided to act and sent an anonymous email to the NGO, warning them about the irregularities at the firm. I hoped the organization could protect itself, but at the same time, the fear that everything would come back to bite me consumed me. Every decision I made seemed to drag my life further down a path I didn't want to follow. As things started to get worse at the firm, everything became even harder for me. The calls didn't stop, and with each passing day, the pressure on the firm grew. I didn't know what to do anymore. My own choice to move forward, to not follow in my family's footsteps, was becoming a constant pain. I couldn't turn back, but I also couldn't disconnect completely. When my father came to me for a conversation, he was visibly exhausted. His face showed the clear signs of someone who had been trying to hold together a crumbling empire. He begged me to return. "Olivia, if you don't do this, we'll lose everything," he said. And for a moment, the fear of losing everything made me hesitate. But soon, clarity took over. I couldn't go back to what had hurt me so much. The tension between us, between me and my family, kept growing every day. They couldn't understand my choice, my need to follow my own path. When my sister called to tell me that my father was trying to manipulate everything and everyone around him, trying to hide the gravity of the situation, something inside me finally broke. I had already known that things were out of control, but the confirmation that he was willing to do anything to save his image made me lose all trust in him. How could I have ever looked at him with such respect and admiration? The feeling of betrayal hurt in ways I couldn't even explain. As the firm continued to collapse, my relationship with my family deteriorated more and more. I saw everything crumbling before me, and I, a stranger, a spectator in all of this, knew that the responsibility of having followed my own path was mine. I couldn't regret it, but at the same time, I felt a deep pain realizing that my own choice had cost so much. Losing trust in my parents, losing my connection with my family was harder than any obstacle I had faced before. Loneliness became an unbearable weight. Even though I was working at the NGO and felt like I was doing something meaningful, the sense of being completely disconnected from everything and everyone gnawed at me. That's when I started to realize that by choosing my independence, I was giving up a type of emotional comfort I never imagined I would lose. I thought about my parents, their decisions, and the lies that had been told over the years. How could someone who had always been my pillar of trust be part of something so dark and dirty? The situation at the firm was getting worse, and my position at the NGO was becoming more and more untenable. It wasn't just the work that was at risk, but also my mental health. The pressure of having been cut off by my family, of losing all their support, was affecting everything around me. I could barely focus on what I was doing. I was getting more and more exhausted, emotionally drained. I didn't know what to do anymore. The idea of fighting alone, with no one to support me, was overwhelming. The reality of the firm's bankruptcy arrived faster than I had imagined. My father, in one last attempt to save what was left of his reputation, started trying to cover up debts with illegal dealings. It didn't take long for the authorities to start investigating. The firm was going down, and I unwillingly found myself at the center of the storm again. Even though I had distanced myself, I still carried the weight of the name and the family. The worst part? I discovered that there was a large amount of money being moved around illegally, and now my position at the NGO was compromised once again. When things reached their breaking point, my father showed up at my door. He was visibly tired, his face showing the clear signs of someone who had been trying to hold an empire together. He begged me to come back. "Olivia, if you don't do this, everything we've built will end." Those words, so full of guilt, still echo in my mind. The problem wasn't the firm or the family legacy anymore. The problem was that I didn't know who I was anymore. I knew my decision was right, but the pressure to go back to help, to try and fix something that seemed lost, was overwhelming. I spent the following weeks in a constant state of doubt. The weight of the choice felt heavier with each passing day. I knew that if I went back, I would never be the same. I would be trapped in a lie, in a world that was never mine. But the fear of losing everything, of being rejected by my family forever, made me question if I was being too selfish. Was I doing the right thing? Was I really choosing my happiness, or just running from the problem? I realized that, deep down, it didn't matter what I did. I would never be able to please everyone. The idea of being the obedient daughter and following in my parents' footsteps was already so far behind me. Even if I tried to go back, I had already crossed a line. Things would never be the same. So, I made the decision to move forward, no matter what happened. Not because I wanted to be rebellious, but because the only way to find peace was by facing the fears and uncertainties that surrounded me. As time went on, the consequences of my choices became more evident. My father and mother distanced themselves from me completely. They no longer saw me as part of the family, and that, in a way, was harder than anything else I had ever lived through. But at the same time, I began to realize that I had to accept this loss. I had to move forward, even if it meant being alone. It was painful, but it was necessary. As the months went by, I began to feel a slight sense of relief. Not that the pain had disappeared, but I was finally freeing myself from something I had always felt wasn't mine. My work at the NGO became more rewarding. Even with all the financial and emotional challenges, I found a sense of purpose that I didn't know existed. I was doing what I had always dreamed of, even though it took a long time to get here. I knew this journey would still have many ups and downs, but I was finally following my own path. And then, almost surreal, the situation with my family started to cool down. The firm was shut down, and the scandal took on proportions greater than anyone could have imagined. I saw the headlines, and in a way, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The cycle was finally breaking, and I was out of it. I didn't want to rejoice in their downfall, but I couldn't deny the feeling of relief. The cycle was finally breaking, and I was free. The situation became clearer. I was no longer part of that world, and I didn't want to be. Life showed me that, no matter how hard I tried, I could never carry the weight of a legacy I didn't choose. And finally, I could fully dedicate myself to what I had always wanted to do, without fear of turning back. But part of me knew I would never forget everything I had lived through. I freed myself from so many shackles, but the pain of that loss still lingered. The scars, however, started to heal. Not completely, but time helped. I knew my life was taking a different, more honest, and more faithful direction. There was no more pressure to please my family, to maintain a facade. I was closer to who I truly wanted to be, and that was liberating. Finally, the weight of expectations fell away. I would no longer be manipulated or pressured to be something I wasn't. Over time, I learned to move forward without looking back. The mistakes and disappointments began to be part of my past. But even with everything that happened, the relief of finally being who I truly am was indescribable. I was living my truth, even though it had meant losing many things along the way. Looking at my life now, I see that the choices I made, no matter how painful they were the ones that truly defined me. And so, the story followed its course. There was no grand ending, no epic twist that changed everything. I simply moved forward, leaving behind what no longer served me. And to this day, I don't fully understand what happened. I don't know how my life changed so drastically in such a short time. I only know that, after all the pain, I finally found my way. Not the path my parents planned for me, but my path. And in the end, that was what really mattered.